I'd like to introduce Judy Seidenbaum, who's a student here, and who will be leaving at 12:25 to go to a class. She is founder and director of Open Space, which is an environmental educational program here in Los Angeles. And Art Seidenbaum, who you may or may not know if you read the paper at all, he's a columnist for the Los Angeles Times. And what I would like to request of you, if possible, is this whole thing is going to be sort of a dialogue if we can do it. And if you could get closer or to the sides where the mics are, they're going to sort of start talking, and then we're going to really invite you to participate as much as you can and maybe share some of your experiences that you've had and sort of if there's been any changing in your self-image and your sex roles vis-a-vis your relationships with other men or women. We'd really be interested in hearing, and it will help us to maybe elicit more of the thoughts we have. So rather than wasting any more time, here we go.
You can begin.
Thank you. We had a perfectly average kind of marriage, I guess, for about 15 years. It seems to me that we will have been married 22 years this June.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess up until about 5 years ago, there was nothing extraordinary about it. We had 2 children. We had a house that we were paying mortgage payments on. I was pretty content, and still am reasonably content with my life, and totally unprepared for a woman who was going to start having a life of her own. And it's been very easy for me during the last 5 years or so to be extraordinarily sympathetic to the women's movement as it affected my day-to-day work in the newspaper. And I think in the outside world, I'm flattered, or I flatter myself, to be regarded as a friend of the movement. At home, however, I have been on many occasions a frustrated, bitter, angry, unloved feeling sorehead about the whole thing. And I guess the only reason we're here, in part, is that when the Women's Resource Center was kind enough to invite me in the first place, it seemed that it was probably time for me to confess that I am not all I am in public print, and sometimes a furious and not only unloved feeling, but unlovable fellow at home. Maybe since Judy's got to go to school, and since I will have the last ha-ha word anyway, she can describe to you what happened to her, and then I will tell you how unpleasant I was about it. When and how did you begin, and why, I guess?
Gee, all those questions at once. Well, I probably began all of this when we first got married. But there was no women's movement in those days, and I don't think any of us thought about it. Most people got married, period. That was the thing to do, and brought up children. Didn't think much beyond that. But one thing did happen that probably triggered all of this in me. Art changed his job to work at the newspaper, and instead of having an office downtown, he decided to write at home. So his first office was in our bedroom. And we thought that would just be neat for a while. But it didn't take very long before we were tripping over each other, and I became a secretary answering his telephone calls. And I also kind of wanted to think a little bit for myself. And I was sculpting at the time at home, so we had all kinds of things going on at home. And it just began to get a little bit too difficult. The kids were growing up too, and that was hard. And I think the more Art was home, the more I decided I'd better do something myself. And maybe he drove me out of the house. I really don't know. We're not exactly positive how this whole thing began. But I got pretty disgusted with me, and also very weary of too much home life. So I just, I don't know, I decided to start working with children in the summertime. I got turned on by my kids. They were complaining bitterly about schools and about their school experience. And I also was kind of interested in working in urban education because I'd always been interested in architecture and urban problems. So we started some summer programs with kids downtown. And by the next year, somehow the thing started mushrooming slowly at first, but I ended up working full-time at our local junior high school, and then decided, gee, it was so good that we were going to incorporate and have a corporation and everything, and really try to work with the school system. And by then it was a we of about 5 or 6 people. And we've just been going ever since. So now I am what's called an executive director, which I find rather funny. And I'm an educational consultant and work with the school system. And the fact that I'm a woman hasn't helped, because I still play tricks with all the people downtown. The people down on the hill in the school system are all men for the most part. And it's very difficult to be a woman talking to them, trying to convince them that something that we're doing is very good. So oftentimes I will take one of the men on our staff with me. And that is a reality of the world still, I'm afraid. I'm not really a part of the women's movement, I don't think. I just kind of come into it by the side door, and I guess somehow here I am. But I never thought about it until fairly recently. I'm very glad it's here, though. It now helps me very much, and I can do much more because of everybody else who cares so much.
I think one of the funny things was how gradually it all happened in one sense. That is, at the very beginning of Judy's involvement, I think I was quite applauding, and I was not feeling threatened at all. And when she was working 2 or 3 mornings or 2 or 3 afternoons a week, life didn't seem to be very different. When it became 5 days a week and all day, every day, then it began to really rankle me, because a lot of the things that are such commonplace household words in the tussle between men and women are the things that maybe really do bother people who have taken a great deal for granted. And I mean the mundane stuff like dinner at night and feeding the dogs and having the plumbing repaired and all those hideous chores. When Judy says, however, that my moving into the house may have had some bearing, I'm not sure about that. It was interesting that I did it. This is not self-defense, but I had done it because I had worked for 2 large companies prior to the LA Times, and the one immediately before the Times was having a terrible kind of bloodbath internally. And I found myself on the side of the purgers, which is almost as bad as being on the side of the purgees. That is, seeing a whole lot of people being thrown away, partly through your effort, is enough to turn any stomach, male or female. So I had moved into the house in part because I didn't want to be part of a big thing anymore. And I thought that was refuge for me. We even built a house so that I would have an office, so that we would not fall all over each other. And I luxuriated in the idea of taking 10 footsteps from bed to work. I can, in retrospect, understand how that might be quite unpleasant for anybody else living in the house.
Now, let me interrupt for a minute. I still have problems, because if I'm home in the morning, and like I was this morning, I will get your phone calls, and I'm there to do homework. And it's very hard, so I begin to resent again and want to escape and go to my own office. But we actually have a reversal right now, because I'm the one that leaves home first thing in the morning, and usually very early, and I get back about 6 o'clock. And Art's home, so he's there to have all the problems with the kids and the animals. And it's slowly working out, I think.
Well, it's gotten fairly heated on occasion, and I suppose maybe it would be better to confess that in answer to direct questions rather than to start a confessional of our own up here. One of the things that has made us slightly uncomfortable today was that NBC called yesterday, I guess in response to the Women's Resource Center, who must have done some fairly exciting promotion of this whole week, and asked just what it was we were going to reveal about ourselves today. And
nothing.
Yeah, at that point I said not much. But I think if there's any use in 2 people who are older than student age bearing, if not their souls, at least their life habits, then fire away.
You're asking for questions from the audience,
yes,
right?
in an oblique way.
Okay, very oblique. I'd like to know what some of you would like to know about. Do you share the housework, Art?
I do 2 chores, essentially. I don't do very much cleaning, but I confess that because Judy is as busy as she is, we have decided to retain a nice woman who comes twice a week and does the bulk of the housework. Is that fair?
Very fair. Thank God for it.
two chores I do. I do occasionally make a bed or straighten up a room, cook a meal, wash a dish. But the two things that I do that I never used to do are all the grocery shopping, which I adore, because there's an old-fashioned, chauvinistic, ogling voyeur instinct which can be satisfied in a large supermarket. And the chore I abominate and hate is the checkbook, which takes me longer than I think it would take any intelligent human being, or should, and which I resent bitterly to this moment. So I figure that one which is a pleasure and one which is a burden is sort of fair.
He feels very martyred about the checkbook, though, I must say. Well, I don't like doing the checkbook, but I did it for 15, 16 years, so I figure it's his turn now. What?
Cooks dinner.
Who cooks dinner? I don't know. We kind of cook it together a lot of the times. It's pretty much a shared thing, and oftentimes by the time I get home, I'm so tired and Art's so weary, and that we have a couple of drinks and we kind of have a half a dinner. It's not very important.
It would not warm the cockles of the American Home, House Beautiful,
No.
or any of those magazines.
I think so, yes.
My doctor says I have too much cholesterol.
She asked if we were both healthy and nutritionally well off. And so far, yes. Yeah. The question is, why am I back in school and what am I studying? I'm in a master's program in the geography department, and I'm really trying to swing a master's in environmental education, which isn't given here yet, and I'm going to try to convince somebody that should be. I want the information because that's the field I'm in, and I also would like the degree, finally. After all these years, it would be nice.
Go ahead.
Well, the question is, how does our change of lifestyles affect the children? And there was a question of shouldn't the female in the house bring up children? Well, I did. Our children are 15 and a half and 18, so they're very much on their own now. Our son is in college and doesn't live at home anymore. When I started to do all of these things about 5 years ago and get busy, it was in my children's own junior high school. And it was kind of fun for them because I was there and they were in some of the programs, and they were also in the programs with me in the summertime. The only problem was that they kind of didn't like working for their mother. But they were left to be freer, actually, and at that time, when they were young teenagers, that was good for them. I think the both of us worry about them a lot, and we get along pretty well as a foursome. We're not a loving, cuddly family, I don't believe, and never were. But the kids were brought up to be fairly independent, and they manage the house very well, and they've stayed by themselves. So, and they cook better than I do, So I think that it's probably been a good thing for them, and at least when we ask them, and I have asked them a number of times what they really think about all of this, they seem to be quite pleased with it, and I have a feeling that they're actually kind of almost proud that both of us are doing something that's interesting and fulfilling to us, because they and their friends have a hard time finding these things.
But I, on the other hand, have, on occasion, when one of the kids screwed up, tended to blame Judy for it because she was out there running about in environmental pastures. In other words, I have used that unfairly, too.
And yet we're very reachable.
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Scream it.
I'll try. The question was, could I go into a step-by-step analysis of my moving out of the house and my liberation? And since I never thought of it that way, this might be difficult for me to do. But I think that I always felt second class after I was married. it didn't take me very long to have that kind of feeling. But I was brought up not to question it, and it was the way of life. I always painted or sculpted or something, so I was very involved with myself and then with my children, and kind of enjoyed housekeeping actually for some crummy reason. I don't know, but I do like neatness, so I guess that helped. But I always it felt like I was in Art's shadow. I was never vocal, and he was very vocal. And I guess it just preyed on me for a long, long time, but I didn't know anything about what to do about it for many, many years. And I suppose when my kids were finally in junior high school and becoming very vocal and screaming themselves about how lousy everything was in their school and also in the world, that kind of triggered something in me, and I said, hey, yeah, I agree. I mean, that's what I care about, and maybe I can do something about it. And I think I don't even remember how it first started, but I got very angry one day and decided that something ought to be done with the whole batch of junior and senior high school kids we were working with, and have them really do something meaningful in the city for a change, instead of messing around at each other's houses and using up whatever was in anybody's refrigerator. Well, yes, it was involved with the first busing program in the city, and we were kind of involved with that in an adult capacity at the time. But there were a batch of kids that needed to come together somehow and do something meaningful in the summertime as well as in the wintertime. And I suggested it to this busing group that we were involved with, and of course they said, yeah, that's fine, that's great, do it. And I hadn't the foggiest idea about how to do anything like that, how to organize anything. I'd never done anything like that, but I did, that's all. I just said, okay, and it was like a challenge. And we started a program that was 2 years worth of program in the summertime, and I slowly, painfully learned how to organize and to run programs. And I started doing a lot of research into education and environmental things, and really began to learn for a change and have a direction. And I suppose that's what finally ended me up really becoming so-called liberated and getting out of the house, because the more I read and learned and started talking to people around the city about something that I cared about, then I began to understand that I couldn't do all that from my house, certainly, and I'd better learn some of the skills of getting along with people in the community and learning how to be out in the world. So I did. I pushed myself, though, and it was not easy. It was very scary, and it still is sometimes, even though I've been in this for a long time. But I'm not normally that way. And there came to be more and more things to do. That's all. The minute you start something, however small it is, if you really get into it and start talking to other people who are involved in a similar interest that you have, you're pushed to do things. And unless you're very overprotective of yourself, I think you just end up doing them. And the time gets to be more and more and more, and what started out to be 3 days a week ended up to be 5 days a week, and some nights and some weekends, and a lot of studying at home. And now I'm back in school for the same reason, so it's a constant 24-hour-a-day thing. And liberation was kind of pushed on me. I didn't decide I was going to be liberated. It just happened, and we've all had to learn a lot about it. And I've also talked to a lot of women who have reminded me of what I've been doing, when I have really thought that I've just been learning more about environmental education. But a lot of it does have to do with being a strong enough human being, an individual, to take a leadership role in my group or in the school system or whatever. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where I am now, and I still have years to learn. Really? Okay. I have I think about 1 minute or so, but I'll try now to...
I'll tell you the real truth in a moment.
Right, but wait a minute. No, I have to get one word in now. I'll try to overlay that part of it onto what I've just told you. At the very beginning, it's true, Art was very interested and excited and responsive to what I felt was a great need, and he was, I think, quite pleased with my taking on some kind of a role in trying to do something, because I gather, and I didn't know this until I really got into it, that he had wanted me to be out in the world a little bit more. He didn't tell me that, though, for a long time. And so when I started, everything was fine. The only problem was, as he said, as soon as I was spending a regular amount of time, in other words, I had hours, finally, and I was no longer really a volunteer, meaning I could just come and go at will. But I had a program going and hours and responsibilities that were not home responsibilities. That's when we started to have our first problems, because I had to say, no, I was not going to be home at such and such a time, or no, I really didn't want to go to that dinner. I had better things to do. I had reading, or I wasn't interested, and I finally became, I suppose, protective in a way of my own time, because I decided there were things that I needed to do that were more important than a lot of the stuff that we were doing, and things I'm not interested in that Art is interested in, and vice versa. So that started a lot of real hassles, and some of them were really quite prolonged and quite violent, and we had a lot of talking to do, and a lot of non-understanding, I must say. I often wished, and I told Art, that if we had had a mediator, it would have been good. Somebody who could interpret for the two of us.
That's because you believe in those things, and I don't. So you see, you can start a fight right with that.
Right, there you go. But we were talking like this, most of the time. And I was just, so hurt that he didn't understand what I was all about. And he did, in a way. It was just that it was changing his structure. I was making my own, and I wasn't blending too well into his anymore, because that one had to move now. And that's a very hard thing for anybody, really, to change their way of life, and that's really what this was all about. So we had many, many hassles, and it lasted several years, actually. And I think that it's been the more I've been involved, the more we have gone, sometimes for periods of time when everything's been peaceful, because I've done better, too, and I think Art does feel some degree of pride in me as a human being now. I mean, as somebody that he cares about, and if you care about somebody, you do like to see that they're doing a good job. So that's been a help. But at the same time, the more I work, the more hassle there is at home. And it's been a very difficult process to figure out the new home structure. And I think finally this year we are beginning to do it, but this is like 5 years worth of very difficult kinds of things, and a lot of really probing to find out what we were both interested in, and my screaming and yelling about, hey, we have to be two individuals. I believe that's the way a marriage should be, instead of, two halves of people coming together, and I don't think Art believed in that at all. I'm not sure that he still does, and I think there's probably both things that have to happen. But this is very, very difficult. But we have, I think now we have worked out a fairly peaceful arrangement, probably because one of our kids is out of the house too. It sure helps. And our daughter is a junior in high school, and she's pretty good at home, and she really is no particular problem, and she helps a lot. So that it's just an easier kind of a thing. If the children were younger, we would probably still be in the middle of all kinds of whirlwinds. Now, though, I think we have finally come together again, just very recently, with some real understanding. Art, I think, now realizes that I am not going to turn off my work at the end of a day. I don't go to a job and then come back and relax, because I'm doing something that I care a lot about, and that's my life. It's not a job. In fact, it isn't a job, because I don't get any money for it. So it is my way of life now, and that had to be realized. And now I can relax a little bit more with it too, I think, so that we do share an awful lot of things in common, a lot of interests.
Can I tell the Jamie story after you go? Is that okay?
I have to
Do I have
go.
your permission, though? I think Jamie's important in the step-by-step
Yes,
thing.
I forgot about that,
Okay.
but it's true. Goodbye,
Goodbye.
everybody. I'm sorry. I'll see you later.
Right. I'm not trying to cut off questions, but in the middle of the 5 years, really, a young man moved into our home at our invitation, who was at that point in time, well, I guess 17 years old. He didn't have the guts to run away to Haight-Ashbury, is the way I usually put it, and I think that's really sort of accurate. He wanted to leave his home, which was a very strange place, because He had no mother. His father was 75 and he was 17, which is a fair-sized generation gap. His father also didn't speak very much English, having been a veteran of the Russian Revolution, fighting on the wrong side, if my memory is correct. But in any event, he moved in partly because our teenage son liked him, and partly because he had been in a series of orphanages and foster homes before moving in with his old father. He was a really nice kid, not a very well educated one at all. And I guess in terms, if you believe intelligence tests at all, and maybe we shouldn't, he was average intelligence. And I think Judy found him to be a remarkable challenge to her as both a new place to dump maternal feelings, as a human being who could be molded and shaped it into something wondrous, and as a person who really did need our help, not just our room and board, and I agreed with that. I, however, was much more cynical about what you could do with a young man in his middle teens than Judy was. And I would openly confess the limits of my expectations about how much good we could do. And Judy would tell me that I was already not helping sufficiently, because if I had these reservations, then that was going to rub off somehow, and he would never sparkle the way either one of us would hope. Well, I don't want to make it a long story, but it turned out that somewhere in between my sense of not doing much good and Judy's sense of doing everything, he became 19 years old and moved out on his own, never having finished high school, having had some brushes with the police, not for doing vicious things to other people, but for doping and for being drunk and for being with other people who had similar lifestyles. And I think he exacerbated our problem somewhat. Certainly not through his intention, because he is a nice guy. But we were both so innocent and naive in one sense about just having another human being in the house, and all the really clever people in this world know that to introduce yet another body and another brain and another set of emotions makes life still more difficult. And the only other postscript to what Judy said is, I don't think we probably haven't had our last argument about all of this, because what I've learned lately that sort of scares me is that all of us are essentially quite conservative. Even those of us who are out at some ramparts talking about change. Change in the details of life are the hardest really to accept. And what I've done is build myself a few analogies in a very homely way to make that apparent to me. If, for instance, peerless laundry changes drivers, and our sheets are not delivered on the right day, or they go to the wrong home, as happens whenever peerless laundry changes drivers, then one of us is goddamn upset. That's really essentially conservatism, to hope that peerless laundry doesn't change drivers. If the answering service that takes over for either one of us when we're not at home changes operators, then one of us becomes terribly upset. Anytime any of the little things that no one likes to think about change, then one thinks about them too much and they become obsessions. And I think that a lot of my guilt, which I accept as guilt, is based on having an extraordinary number of little things change that I never wanted to bother about at all, which was quite selfish and unfair and not very profound. But I think that's where the man-woman difficulties arise. If I would like to know, it seems to me if a woman and a man begin a relationship with a lot of things understood that remain relatively constant, not in terms of their emotional relationship, not talking about sexual roles, I am talking about sexual roles, I'm not talking about sexual constancy. If their agreements with each other, and I don't mean contracts either, are agreements that they can live with from the outset and become convenient to live with for a long time, then it seems to me that the deeper emotional problems are much easier to solve, that when there is upset at the superficial level, then upset at the deeper level is immediately to follow. Maybe that's not so sensible. I think it's true.
When you ask a question, if it's all possible, try to use the mic unless you're embarrassed.
That would be nice.
Out.
Yeah.
Well,
so
wait,
you can't get out of there very easily, sir. The question has to do with money. Since somebody in a relationship has to earn money to live on, and since Judy admitted that what she was doing was an unpaid act, is there hostility about the fact that here she is running around not being paid, in effect costing us money? No. For sensible or other reasons, I was the one who originally suggested to Judy that she not get paid, and it's a complicated piece of business. But the first year that they had any funding at all, that is Open Space, her organization, they got a rather small grant from the federal government, and she needed a fair number of people to work with her. It was not enough money to pay any one of them a decent salary. It seemed to me that if we could, as the only people who were middle class in her group, afford to have her work for nothing, that would certainly mean that the people who worked with her could feel less resentment about the inadequacy of their salary, and furthermore, it might indeed be a political advantage in getting further funding later. That is, if you can say, here's a group of people, all of whom are working for starvation wages, and one of whom, the one who started it, getting nothing at all, then obviously after they've been doing that for 2 years, they're fairly dedicated people. So the answer is no. We've had some money troubles in the last few years, but that's too strong. We have not spent money the way we used to because of this, but that has never been a problem. Yeah.
Do I understand what you were saying before, that if a young couple starts out in married life with the understanding or contract, whatever you want to call it, that they will have this lifestyle that is easier than the man to accept that if it happens with you after 15 years?
The question was I suggesting that if two people start their relationship with understandings, is that going to be simpler than what happened to me after 15 years? Yeah, that's what I meant. And I suppose in this fairy tale, I am the old dog who had a hell of a lot of trouble learning new tricks. And I think both of us will admit that it's much easier to be the protagonist of a story such as this one, that is Judy's role, than it is to be the person acted upon, or the one who must react to the protagonist's activities. Go ahead. The question was, if I were a newlywed now, what would my expectations be? What would my priorities be in terms of wanting a wife first, a lover first, a woman first, a mother? I think it would be a lot easier for me to marry now. Well, that's not fair. When I did marry, I didn't expect any of these problems. And like Judy, I think we both grew up at a time when she was, Memories of an Ex-Prom Queen, and I don't know what popular male prototype I was, but we did the expectable things. I do believe, we talked about this a little bit at well, I can't dignify what we do in the morning as breakfast either, but we talked over coffee this morning, and I said to Judy, suppose you had children who were 7 and 5 right now, would you have gone through this 5-year thing? And she said she thought she would, but that she really believes that both parents must bring up children, and I really believe that too. We've had a lot of trouble with daycare centers because we both believe in them, but we also believe that parents should have a large time stake in every kid, that bringing children into the world is an arrogance anyway. And if you're going to hope to get away with that arrogance without hurting the rest of humanity, either because you've dumped more numbers on it or you've dumped emotional problems on it, then you really should spend an extraordinary amount of time during the early years trying to be whatever the definition of a parent is today. I don't know if Judy were 20 years old today whether she'd want to get married at all, and I don't want to answer that question for her. If I were, I probably would, because there is still an old-fashioned side of me that thinks, well, I won't even use the word marriage. I would want to be living with one other human being, a woman, because of whatever my sexual orientation is. And I do believe that there is something that two people can have between each other that is impossible to have in a group situation. I feel my emotional hunger still, and Judy still satisfies that hunger, is to have one person in this world in whom I can confide all. Because I don't want to confide in 5 people, or in a household, or in a group encounter session. And so that's helpful to me. Now, I don't know what it would be to Judy. That does not mean that I would want that one person also to be my practitioner in everything else. I would like the person with whom I live to be her own human being. I would like merely to be a consultant in her life as she is in mine. Now that sounds very clinical, but I think those are solvable things. The difficult things are the changes. What in part produced our difficulty, obviously, were things I was not even aware that I was doing, which had to do with insensitivity and taking things and people for granted. And when Judy says that she learned much later that I really wanted her to be out in the world some, that's quite true. But Judy living her, what she called a second-class life, voluntarily for all those years, had convinced me that, I guess the fair thing to say was that I felt part father and part husband, and I didn't really like it, but I felt that that was part of my responsibility. And that's really a very ugly thing to do, to feel part father and part husband. And I'm sure it was not really good for Judy, and I'm sure it was not really good for me, but I was used to making a lot more decisions than I think 2 equal human beings should make when they're living together. Now, what would my priorities be? I think my priority would be the depth of the relationship between the two of us, and whatever living arrangement would preserve whatever love is would be my priority. I don't know what love is, really. It's something that I think I have felt and do feel. It is not something I live with around every clock, and I don't think it's something everybody lives with constantly. But first priority on being a mother, no. Probably wouldn't have children today at all. First priority on housekeeping and that sort of thing, no. Probably wouldn't have a house today if we started again. First priority on how we feel about each other, that's all.
You've been so very honest about your hostility and the bad things you've felt. What have been the ameliorating factors that you might recommend to others going through this?
Could everybody hear? I wonder if the microphone's working. The question was that since I've been somewhat candid about the hostilities, what were the ameliorating factors? I presume what you'd really like to know is why have we gone through the whole exercise and stay together? How? Well, the how is complicated. Judy has twice run off to see therapists. I use the verb run off, I think, because I really don't believe in therapists. And each time she did that, she did it in order to preserve the relationship. And each time she did it, it infuriated me because the ugly father side of me said, that's not what you should do, and we have to deal with this together and not with Joe out there. I think it has helped her, though, oddly enough. In both cases, the sessions lasted only a couple of months. Two different people, both of whom are very intelligent, male. Let me explain why, then, since we're being booed. In the first instance, it was a man recommended by a very close friend of Judy's who is a woman. So, if that's any help at all. The second instance was that the man whom she went to most recently is a guy who had worked with her as a volunteer, that is, worked in that program. And he was the person who I think knew her best in terms of what was going on in her life. So I think that's excusable. In any event, I think it has helped her, and in retrospect, I might not be so hostile the third time around. What we've done, though, is learn how fascinating it is, really, to sit up for 3 or 4 hours and talk about how people can be together so very long and still have so much to learn and still want to be with each other. Now, I suppose that's the ameliorating factor. I don't know why we still want to be with each other, because God knows we've talked about that too. But as long as that desire remains, we would both, I guess, work fairly hard to stay together. And if we have crossed the top of the parabola and it's all easier and downhill now, that's fine. I'm not sure. But I think it is because, well, what we tried to say, and I hope this is true, we have tried to say that we would not stay together for the children, we would not stay together for our parents, we would certainly not stay together for the neighborhood or for the Los Angeles Times, but that we would stay together if we wanted to stay together. And since that still seems to be the operant emotion, we are together. And I think it is going to be easier. Maybe not easier. It's going to be more comfortable for both of us. I guess there is, though, in us, because we are in our 40s, probably more resistance to wanting to admit the failure of a relationship that may exist in 20-year-olds today. So I certainly don't want to dump our experience on anybody. It seems both unfair and dishonest.
Let me ask a question. I was wondering, my experience with my family, as I guess with a lot of people, I was wondering if your children helped to mediate some of the hostilities and arguments or whatever was going on. I was wondering what their role was at all.
Absolutely, never helped. Our son, who has now moved out, was having emotional, dropping out, doping, self-finding problems of his own, and was in love at the height of our upset with each other, and I think for his own protection decided that he would not get involved. Our daughter, I don't think knew very much about the tensions and hostilities, and I don't know how much she knows now, but we never invited them to become paste or glue in our marriage, and they never attempted to. And I'm not so sorry about that.
Were they ever divided?
Were the children ever divisive? Yes. Because during that same period, I realized that there was a dictatorial side of me, and Judy, who was swimming into environmental education and, by extension, open schools and free schools, wanted to be much less restrictive all of a sudden than I did. So we had some pretty violent arguments, and I spent... This sounds like a cry for self-pity, but it really did get funny. At one point, I had been to the Purdue Street police station so many times at 3 o'clock in the morning that when I walked in one night, one of the police women said to me, "Oh, hello, Art, how are you?" And she doesn't read the paper, or at least she said she didn't read the paper, and I realized that I had become a kind of a hanger-on, bailing not only our kid, but other kids out, or trying to. And so each time I went in the middle of the night to the police station, I became more and more willing to be the Ronald Reagan of our block rather than the bleeding liberal. So yes, there were some terrible tensions about how to deal with teenagers who are having emotional problems, and I don't think that's avoidable, unfortunately. See, I think because I imagine Judy thinks that I had usurped a great deal of the decision-making power in terms of bringing up children before then, that the screw-ups may have been a result of her not having had a sufficient hand in their childhood, whereas I had, on the other hand, the feeling that since Judy and I were no longer agreeing and in perfect concert, a lot of the screw-ups were based on the fact that we didn't have a united front anymore. So, sure, every person in these things compounds things. I assume people couldn't hear, but the woman said that one thing Judy said was something she would take exception to. When Judy said that her work was her life and that she didn't leave it at the office, it seemed to her that a family and the relationships there should still be so important that you cannot be professional all the time. I don't want to excuse Judy fully, but I think, and this may be patronizing on my part, but I think since Judy's been doing this only a few years, she has not yet come to the kind of terms with professionalism and pleasure and family that men do, say, by maybe 35. Now, that's not because men are very good about this. I all of a sudden realized one day that I was playing the role of the wounded housewife. You know, why don't you get home from the office earlier? You don't have to have that meeting. Why don't you have that meeting between 8 and 10 in the morning so that we can have cocktails at the hour we choose to? And I know I did that to Judy when we were young, and I'm sure there are people still doing that to each other, whether men or women today. People who think that their work is so all-consuming and important that that's what they must do. Judy did say later, I think, that she's beginning to relax more with what she's doing, and I think that's what she meant. Yes, it's her life, and yes, she has a great deal to prove because do-good operation though it may be, it is still a venture, and in that sense a business that must establish itself, and it has gone through all kinds of pangs, and I'm sure any of you who deal with the federal government know what kind of pangs it is to try to get money out of that stone today. So I don't think she's guilty of that, but I've certainly felt that on occasion. Yeah. Has my reputation helped Judy, or has it discouraged her from getting out in the world and doing her own work? Well, I don't know about my reputation. My contacts in this world have helped her in a perfectly indecent sense. There was a wife of a UCLA dean sitting on the side before, whose husband is on Judy's board because he has to do with environment and planning and architecture, and we know those people through my work. She's had entree to politicians' offices. That's been all okay. I've had to be careful about never writing about what Judy was doing, never participating in their fundraising activities, and I'm fairly Puritan and priggish about not letting either of us exploit the newspaper or my connection with it. I don't know that it's been a hindrance at all, except I do know that Judy still resents it if we are together somewhere and I am introduced as me and she is introduced as my wife and nothing else is said, even when people know that she works every day. And I admit that she works more hours than I do most days. And I sometimes admit that what she's doing has more easily translatable benefits to the society than what I do. I don't always admit that. But there are still residual problems based on the fact that I am a minor, well-known figure in town, and she's still a struggling world saver.
One more question. We're going to have to wind down. Dana?
There were two questions. One, what is my feeling about the media's treatment of the movement? And two, how do I feel about prominent or outstanding women who, when interviewed, say, I'm not a member of the movement, but. Let me deal with the last one first. I think it is quite human for anyone who has done something outstanding or exceptional or difficult to want to be her own or his own person and not be a member of a movement. And I think the outstanding people have never really suffered, or the extraordinary person has never suffered. The extraordinary black person did not suffer. In fact, maybe it was helpful to Ralph Bunche to be black, say. The extraordinary woman has never suffered. Anais Nin really doesn't come off as a liberationist at all, the way I read her. The extraordinary anything gets by, and the inclination is always not to want to be a part of the class action, because that's not fun. So I think what happened in the black movement is certainly going to happen in the women's movement, although I think for less good reason. That is, I don't think you can compare the oppressions for very long without discovering that it's harder to be black than to be female, or maybe that's just bigotry on my part. But there came a time, maybe 6 years ago, when black people, both extraordinary, exceptional, and just plain comfortably successful, had to go back and pay their dues or be rejected by the rest of the movement. And I'm sure that's happening in the women's movement now. It won't be so easy for, I'm trying to think of someone who has said that recently. I'm not a member of the movement, but I can't. But in any event, I think there will be pressure from the movement on those female celebrities to acknowledge, if not their membership in the movement, their womanhood and the fact that other women don't have it quite so easy for whatever reason. The media has done a rotten job all along, of course, partly because the media took the easiest way out at the beginning, which was to treat it all as a joke. And that's the way men have treated women, as locker room jokes. And the media was essentially male and still essentially is male. Every movement has been treated as something of an animated cartoon at the very beginning, with the possible exception of the black movement, but maybe even that was too. It's much simpler to deal with angry people by patting them on the head and laughing at them. In fact, in day-to-day life, if someone shrieked into this room right now and did something totally unpleasant toward you, I think your first response would be to smile and to hope it would go away. And I think the media treats almost every movement that way at the beginning. There were enough intelligent people in the movement and around it to make that impossible after a time. The progress in serious treatment of women is very slow, and now we get into another one of those analogous situations with the black movement. A lot of editors would like to say, well, look at the progress that's been made. For instance, Jean Taylor is now not only the editor of the View section, but the first woman who's able to go to the executive dining room of the Los Angeles Times. I guess with the exception of Mrs. Chandler. People can say that without kidding. And that's a danger. Because then when the movement laughs at that, they are guilty of the same kind of derisive treatment of what somebody else feels is a significant thing. We have, on all sides of every question in the last decade, I think, been guilty of dreadful rhetoric and inadequate reporting. And I'm not just talking about the media now. But it has been much simpler to laugh or to condemn and not listen. And so what progress there is now, thanks to Ms., which is a serious magazine, and thanks to the women who are willing to talk to the establishment press, and thanks to a slightly growing awareness on the part of reporters, I think a better forum than there was. I think the coverage of this week will probably turn out to be better than it would have been a year ago. So our argument would be about speed, I guess, and scheduling, and who's really trying hard enough and working fast enough. And I suppose there is no resolution to that argument. I'm enjoying the women's movement, which is a terrible thing to say, because sometimes when I say that I think Pardon? Oh, I thought somebody said so. I think I'm enjoying it the way one enjoys, oh God, and this is too sexual, sticking one's tongue in a cavity and seeing if it still hurts a little bit. It has been interesting to me to realize that life does not get simpler as one gets older. And whereas I think a lot of us in my generation thought that if we worked like bastards for 20 years, then our kids would be in college and we would be living in a post and beam home, and our wives would be off potting or sculpting, and everything would begin to make sense, and that the materialistic dream might not be so bad at this point in time. Well, the materialistic dream is fatuous, and I think most of us are now learning that what really is exciting about life is that although it would be nice to be conservative about peerless cleaners and the answering service and every detail, the upset in those details keeps us from aging and creaking and becoming arthritic. I realize that's a rhetorical answer to your question, but I'm sure that we wouldn't agree on the schedule. I just think it is a little better.
I'm sorry to say we're going to have to end this. The program was supposed to have started here 10 minutes ago.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's my fault.